Welcome. My subject today is materialism, both from a sort of cultural aspect and sort of personal observation. This is a very materialistic time in our culture. Materialism, the word, expresses a couple of different ideas. One is the valuing of material possessions, a big house, fancy car, lots of expensive appliances, designer clothes, etc. The second meaning is that the totality of life is material, which can be observed with our senses, and there is nothing beyond that. Both of these meanings express a spiritual poverty, which I'd argue that while material possessions are not in themselves a sure indicator of spiritual poverty, excess attachment to them certainly is. Many Christians might want to deny it, but the Jesus of the Gospels references to material possessions are generally entirely negative. He asks followers to leave all possessions behind them. This attitude to material possessions is quite common in Eastern religions too. It's interesting that while a lot of religious folk can still quite seriously reject icons, the use of icons, they seldom have the same fervour and rejection of material possessions. This idea that the whole of existence is material, and this is the concept that I will be exploring in this blog, has an experiential aspect to it, and it is the cultural norm of the modern era, now more so than any time in history. Why this is the case is difficult to say. David Bentley Hart's new book, Roland by Moonlight, based on imaginary conversations with his dog Roland, writes, this is Roland speaking, "There was a time again when your kind was much better able to see the gods, the angels, deified, mortal, spirits, fairies, what have you, than now you are. Not because there was a stabler and more open causeway between the two hemispheres of your brains, or anything like that, but because there was a wider, more richly populated open causeway between your souls and the cosmos. And those gods, or what have you, were also mirrors of what you are as spiritual beings, there above. That they came more easily into full sensuous manifestation, so long as human beings were in a state of what Barfield called original participation. Unlike him, however, I don't believe that your kind's estrangement from that original, more vividly theophanic world is simply a temporary stage, a kind of probationary process on the way to a post-critical final participation. It would be nice to imagine that that's the case, but I fear the reality will be one of continuing, deepening estrangement." In Vedantic terms, we say that we're in the Kali Yuga, the lowest, most material of the four ages. It is interesting, Hart's reference to Barfield here. While I find the general outline of the changes in consciousness that have happened across the historical period fit with Barfield's account of the move away from original participation, the idea of final participation is an interesting one. It doesn't seem like Barfield himself attained to such a state. It would be argued that Steiner did, but I don't think so. His autobiography showed that he had spiritual sight from a young age. It was not something that he created through a certain type of thinking, and there is no evidence that he was able to guide his followers into such an experience. The anthroposophical movement has so far not ushered in a new post-material age, or even really subculture. Can't be too down on it really for that. Nothing else has either. There are serious philosophical issues with materialism. There are certainly plenty of intelligent people who have expended a lot of time into shoring up its arguments, but for me they always come across as special pleading. The most consistent philosophical position seems to me to be Richard Dawkins' view of humans as lumbering robots. Our thoughts and consciousness are a byproduct of our biological processes. The physical activity in our brains produces thoughts. That strikes me as the clearest, most consistent materialistic philosophy. I don't know that this is the predominant philosophical position, and materialism is assumed as the default position for most people. It doesn't necessarily rest upon a clearly expressed philosophy. But what also seems obvious about this is that no one, including Richard Dawkins, would act in a way consistent with thinking it's true. Thinking is a direct experience, and our thoughts are guided by the nature of their content. They are associative, reason-based, or inclination. We judge them qualitatively, not as given through a mindless biological process. But here I don't want to explore so much the philosophical foundation of spiritual or materialistic thought, but just reflect on how I see it playing out in our culture, through a few examples that have struck me recently. The first example was seeing Rupert Sheldrake reference that he had been included in a Spiritual 100 list from 2021 as being one of the 100 most influential living spiritual figures in the world. My initial thought was, that's quite nice. Rupert probably deserves that. He has pretty significant work in creating experiments for psychic phenomena or non-material action at a distance, and his theory of morphic resonance is an interesting one in exploring form in living organisms, something that DNA research hasn't been able to do. So I went to the list, and I'll put a link in the description. I see that the Pope and the Dalai Lama were there, as you would expect. But then I see that it includes David Attenborough, Sam Harris, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who aren't spiritual at all. So I looked at the criteria. The first two are non-controversial. You need to be alive, have to have made a unique spiritual contribution on a global scale. Fair enough. But criteria 3, the person is frequently Googled, appears in Nielsen data, has a Wikipedia page, and is actively talked about throughout the internet. By taking into account the amount of times that a person is Googled, or how many times their Wikipedia profile is viewed, the list gains a highly democratic and transparent parameter. So here we have a ostensibly spiritual list, and the criteria is quantitative. How many times Googled, has a Wikipedia page. Spirituality is qualitative. This strikes me as an excellent example of just how pervasive materialism is now. A list dedicated to the idea of spiritually influential people has a bunch of people in it who are not spiritual, and it has quantitative parameters for choosing them. The next point is I've seen some articles and watched a Netflix documentary on near-death experiences, which I find fascinating. And seeing them is a good thing. But near-death experiences are when people, usually as a result of an accident or medical emergency, experience a time where their body experiences death, their pulse and brain activity flatlines, and during that time they have an experience of leaving their body. These experiences feel very real. In fact, they feel more real than life here, a greater sense of awareness. They also lose their fear of death, and in most instances, the idea of returning to life on earth is not an attractive one. They feel they have gone home. Here I'm going to read an experience by Dr. Mary Neal, excerpted from her book, Heaven and Back. She spent 30 minutes submerged in rapids after a kayaking incident. And here's the moment where she leaves her body. At that moment, my body was released and began to tumble. I felt a pop. It felt as if I had finally shaken off my heavy outer layer, freeing my soul. I rose up and out of the river, and when my soul broke through the surface of the water, I encountered a group of 15 to 20 souls, human spirits sent by God, who greeted me with most overwhelming joy I have ever experienced and could ever imagine. It was joy at an unadulterated core level. Their brilliance was both blinding and invigorating. We did not speak, per se, using our mouth, but easily communicated in a very pure form. My arrival was joyously celebrated, and a feeling of absolute love was palpable as these spiritual beings and I hugged, danced, and greeted each other. The intensity, depth, and purity of these feelings and sensations were far greater than I could ever describe with words, and far greater than anything I have experienced on earth. God's world is exponentially more colourful and intense. It was as though I was experiencing an explosion of love and joy in their absolute, unadulterated essence. It is impossible for me to adequately describe what I saw and what I felt. When I try to recount my experiences now, the description feels very pale. I feel as though I am trying to describe a three-dimensional experience while living in a two-dimensional world. The appropriate words, description, and concepts don't even exist in our current language. My companions and I began to glide along a path, and I knew that I was going home, my eternal home. We were returning to God, and we were all very excited. Our vocabulary is just not rich enough to describe the experience in a way that is understandable. Perhaps that is why Jesus often spoke in parables. I felt my soul being pulled towards the entry, and as I approached, I physically absorbed its radiance and felt a pure, complete, and utterly unconditional absolute love that emanated from the hall. It was the most beautiful and alluring thing I had ever seen or experienced. Mary's sense of going home and likening God's world to a three-dimensional world and this one to only two. She has a sense of completion and wholeness that we don't have here. And religious language keeps coming into account because, of course, it is a religious experience. But when we strip our culture of religious language, we lose even what tools we have to communicate this kind of experience. Another thing that fascinated me about the Netflix documentary was how those returning here often felt alienated from those around them. One woman spoke of the difficulty she had coming back. As she said, "I find it hard to even talk to my husband. What I used to know is not what I know now. It's so hard when everybody else's point of view hasn't changed." And in one of the articles I read, it countered these experiences with this quote: "These kind of theories put Grayson on wobbly ground among neuroscientists who mostly agree the mind to be a product of the brain. This is an expression of not just scientific but cultural orthodoxy, and it's completely inimical to this kind of experience. They experienced something that revealed truth about their own nature, that there is a greater and more loving reality, that the nature of the mind is closer, is a better analogy for our existence than the nature of matter, that we survive the death of our body." And this is just flatly rejected by this statement. It's a severe impediment to understanding and experiencing who we are and what we really are. I would also say the spirit of art can't truly survive in such a paradigm. At the start I mentioned the spiritual list, which has a number of spiritual but not religious types on it. And at the end, I want to talk about fundamentalism. So that's the religious, not spiritual type. This is a good quote from C.S. Lewis. If fundamentalism means accepting as a point of faith at the outset the proposition, every statement in the Bible is completely true in a literal, historical sense, that would break down at once on the parables. St. Jerome said that the whole Mosaic account of creation was done after the method of a popular poet. Of course I believe the composition, presentation, and selection for inclusion in the Bible of all books to be guided by the Holy Ghost, but I think he meant us to have sacred myth and sacred fiction as well as sacred history. George MacDonald applauds those who want to find out what the Bible really means. We must dive into meaning and explore it. It is not on the surface of the page as a literal, historic meaning. So there we have it. I wanted to show that the encroachment of materialism isn't just a matter for atheists. It is encroached to the realms of the spiritual and the religious. What can we do? Well, we can do some easy things like avoiding some of the materialistic metaphors. Say, I don't think that way, rather than my brain isn't wired that way. We can develop our spiritual practice in the acts of human kindness and compassion. And for those who love reading, read the spiritual classics and meditate deeply upon them. Thank you.